Hello G2 and welcome to week 4 of our series Heart After God, Lessons from the Life of David. This week we're going to be looking at David's experiences of the wilderness. So that's exploring trusting God in times of waiting. Last time we were at small group we were reading chapter 18 and this is now chapter 24. So a lot has happened, but in a brief summary, King Saul, he wants David dead, and there's been countless accounts of David escaping. And eventually he escapes to the desert, and that's where David has been for years, and he will be for years. There's kind of not really any account of him being in the desert, other than this one, and Psalm 63, which he writes when he's there. But on this occasion, King Saul has found out that he's in a desert and sent 3,000 men to find him and has gone with them. So he's searching for David, and at one point he decides he needs a wee, which is, fair enough. And he goes for a wee in a cave, and weirdly enough, David finds him there. So yeah, that's where we're picking up from. David is not king yet. He's in this time of wilderness beforehand, and he has found King Saul weeing in a cave. So on that note, open your Bibles to chapter 24 and give it a read. So I am in the wilderness of York, Clifton Nature Reserve. It's maybe not as wild as where David was in the desert, but it's the best I can get. He was also in the desert for 7 to 10 years. I've been outside for about 15 minutes, and it's a bit cold. I think he's got a bit more grit than me. But this idea that David was in the wilderness for 7 to 10 years it's not quite conceptualized in the Bible verse, I guess. It doesn't we didn't get a lot of details about what it was like in the wilderness and really what happened out there. We don't know what happened out there. And I wonder what happened in those 7 to 10 years in the wilderness. Let's have a look at Psalm 63. That's probably one of the only pieces of information we have about David in the wilderness. So give that a read and come back. So this is a psalm of praise. He is praising God in the wilderness. He's saying, you are so awesome. He is declaring God's goodness and his eternal promise of victory. And one of the bits which really stood out to me, which I think paints a really interesting picture about David's experience in the wilderness, was he sought God's sanctuary in a dry and thirsty land. It wasn't when things were great. It was when he was thirsty. He was in the desert. It was dry. There was nothing there. And he is praising God's name. And he is trusting in him. Also, he's been told he's going to be king, and he's in the desert. He's in the desert for years. There was, on my gap year, we were put on a faith trip. So what this looked like was we were in Barcelona, and there were 3 people in my group, and they took all of our credit cards away, our phones, debit cards, cash, absolutely everything. They gave us a Nokia brick, and they gave us a €5 note each, so 15 euros between us. And they said, you have to get to Freiburg in Germany. And we want you to pray, and we want you to use faith to get there. And we knew where we were going. We'd prayed about it a lot. We were like, God is going to get us there. Like, we have faith in that. We prayed a lot about whether to do the trip. And we prayerfully decided, yeah, we're going to do this. So we knew where we were going. We knew where God had told us we were going, a bit like David had been told, you're going to be king. And then there was this really huge gap of I have absolutely no idea how we're going to get there. And there were many times when we were in the wilderness, many times where we made the wrong decision. And what we did in the wilderness really dictated what happened when we had moments like David did, where his character was tested and where he had to really trust in what God had told him and how he was going to do it. Because God had told him he was going to be king, but in that moment in the cave, it was a real moment of how are you going to get there? Because, God teaches us not to murder. So, well, he could have, and he would have become king. And he had a decision there to make. So there was this one time on our faith trip where we didn't do what David did. We knew we had to go north, and so we got on a train. And we decided not to pray about it, but that God had told us to go that way, so we just do that. But it was completely illegal. We didn't have a train ticket. And we, lo and behold, we were caught. We were told to get off the train at our next station, to give all the money that we had, and we ended up in this city with nothing at all, like no money. We were trying to find a bench to sleep on. Ridiculous. And we realized what we'd done, and we kind of came back to God, and somebody did end up, miraculously, it was by the grace of God, they gave us money for a hostel and for some food. So God really came through for us. But that was an example of God had told us where we were going, and we took it upon ourselves to get there ourselves. And we didn't obey God's commandments. We didn't bring him into the process. So the reason I shared those stories was they have this time of wilderness where, similarly to David, where you know where you're going, but you're not there yet. And God's made a promise, but you're not really sure how that's going to look in the day to day. And, we didn't trust God. We didn't trust that God was going to provide. And so we took the easy way out, and it didn't end well because we did it legally. Whereas David, he did trust God was going to provide. And so he didn't have to murder Saul because God was going to fulfill his promise. And I wonder what this time of wilderness is for, because we see it throughout the Bible. It happened to the Israelites for 40 years and then 4,000 years. Opposite way around though. And then David, it happened. And then also Jesus, he was in the wilderness, in the desert, before his time of ministry. And I wonder what this time of wilderness is for. God seems to build people's characters up. Seems to reveal who he is in this time of waiting, and teaches us to lean into him. Because when we come out of the wilderness, we're going to have to use that. This is important character building time, and it's not just because we're humans. It's because Jesus was a human, but even the Son of God had this time in the wilderness. But it's not easy. It's really not easy. And I guess what would be really great is if that we spend some time reading Psalm 63 together and praying through it, because you might relate to it, but you also might not. You might feel really lost. You might feel really frustrated and angry. I feel like if I was David, I would have been maybe more on that end of frustrated and angry, but something in the wilderness, he leaned into it. He leaned into God, and he learned to praise him in the desert. He praised him when he was thirsty. And what a joy that would be if we can go through times of wilderness, trusting and knowing that God will fulfill his promises. And that doesn't necessarily mean very specific things in life. God doesn't tend to make those sort of promises. But he does make promises that he's going to provide. He does make promises. Oh, hello, there's a dog. God's promises in our wilderness. God's promises are things like he is provider. He will always be with us. He is redeemer. They're less specific, which can be quite difficult, I think, in times of wilderness. And I wonder, you may or may not be in a time of wilderness. And by that, I mean, God has said something and you don't know how it's going to happen. God said he's going to provide, as he does for all of us. But do you know what? you can't find a job. Like, how is that going to happen? How is he going to fulfill his promises? And that's a time of wilderness, and that's so often where God builds character. I wonder if you think David's time of wilderness made a difference to his time in the cave. Do you think he would have made a different decision? I don't know. There's no way of knowing. I wonder what time of wilderness means for you. I wonder how do you lean into God? Is it a difficult thing? Is it easy? Is it easy to trust in his promises? Do you often want to make a plan? How much of a plan do we have to make? And how much do we have to say God made his promise? I'm not sure. It'll be great to discuss these things. But first, we're going to go through our 4 stages that we've been practicing each week. They'll come up onto the board, onto the screen, for you guys to go through to explore this for yourselves and to explore the context. And then after that, we're going to read Psalm 63 together as a small group, and then pray for each other. You might relate to it. You might also feel so far from it and lost in the wilderness. And I'm going to ask you guys to pray together, that you would lean into God in a time of wilderness, and that his promises would be easy to trust. So have a little chat and then have a read and a pray.